Fate had led them to a ruined castle, a dark and imposing silhouette against the grey sky. Cold, moss-covered stones, crumbling towers that looked like claws pointing to the heavens, and a ghostly echo that answered every uncertain step. It was not a home, but a tomb waiting, yet Ilara had promised her deceased wife she would care for the boys, and a castle, even in ruins, was better than the open snow. With the little firewood they had gathered and the ingenuity of one who had seen many winters, they lit an improvised fire in what had once been a great hall, its weak warmth battling the icy vastness. While the grandchildren, with the innocence of youth, imagined themselves knights in their new magic castle, old Ilara, with hands that trembled but did not give up, began to remove loose stones from the floor, searching for a drier place to sleep. It was then that the hollow sound of a poorly set stone caught her attention, and what she found upon lifting the slab changed everything. The hollow sound reverberated, not as an empty echo, but as the promise of something hidden. Ilara, breath held, felt her heart quicken in her wrinkled chest. Her hands, calloused by a life of labor and deprivation, hesitated for an instant over the stone slab she had just dislodged. The fire, now more a dying ember than a vibrant flame, cast dancing shadows that distorted reality, transforming every crack in the walls into curious eyes. The grandchildren, oblivious to the gravity of the moment, had already fallen asleep, their small bodies nestled under the rags that served as blankets, perhaps dreaming of the knights and princesses who inhabited the ruins. With renewed effort, Ilara pushed the heavy slab aside, revealing a dark, damp opening. The air rising from it was cold, laden with the scent of ancient earth and guarded secrets. It wasn't just a hole in the ground. Something was there, something that time and oblivion had tried unsuccessfully to claim. Her eyes, accustomed to the gloom, took a moment to discern the shape, but intuition, that old companion of the disadvantaged, screamed that it was not a trap, but an opportunity. Carefully, she stretched her trembling arm into the darkness. Her fingers brushed against a rough, cold surface, then something smooth and metallic, an object, large, heavy. Adrenaline began to pump through her veins, pushing away the weariness that had pursued her for months. With all the strength she had left, and with the help of one of the loose stones as an improvised lever, Ilara managed to drag the object out of the hole. It was a chest, small but incredibly heavy, made of dark, robust wood, reinforced with rusted iron straps and an intricate bronze clasp, corroded by time. Centuries of dust covered it like a shroud, but even beneath the layer of grime, the promise of its contents was palpable. Her fingers trembled as she touched the clasp. There was no padlock, just a simple yet stubborn mechanism. With a soft click, which sounded like thunder in the silence of the hall, the clasp yielded. Ilara lifted the lid with an almost reverent slowness. What her eyes found made her heart stop for an instant before it began to beat with uncontrolled fury. They weren't glittering jewels or magical artifacts, but something far more valuable to someone fleeing death. Coins, hundreds of them, thousands. Gold coins, the golden gleam, even under the weak firelight, was almost blinding. Ilara picked one up, feeling its cold, pleasant weight in her palm. It was ancient, bearing the effigy of an unknown king, and a crest she had never seen. The sound of the coins clinking against each other as she sifted through them was a forgotten melody, a song of hope she hadn't heard in years. With this, she thought, with this she could buy food, firewood, a real roof for her grandchildren. With this, they could survive the winter, but the chest held more than just gold. At the bottom, beneath the pile of coins, lay a rolled parchment, tied with a faded silk ribbon and sealed with a royal wax seal, almost intact. Ilara picked it up carefully, feeling the rough texture of the aged parchment. She unrolled it slowly, her eyes tracing the elegant, Archaic letters, written in a script that seemed to dance across the page. At first, the words were just shapes, a forgotten language. But Ilara, despite her simple life, had been taught to read by her mother, a woman of unusual wisdom. Slowly, word by word, the truth began to unfold before her, more shocking than any treasure. It was a deed, a royal document, centuries old, signed by a king she barely knew from ancient tales, and what it granted was unbelievable. The parchment spoke not of a mere plot of land, but of a vast estate, an estate that included not only the ruined castle where she now sheltered, but also the surrounding forests, the fertile fields, and, most astonishing of all, the village itself. The village that had cast her out, that had condemned her to snow and hunger, was now, by ancestral right, hers. Her wife's family name was there, etched into history as the rightful heirs, and Ilara, as the widow of the last direct descendant, was the sole and undisputed owner. The air seemed to thin in the icy hall. The gold was a blessing, but this was power. A cruel twist of fate, an irony as bitter as it was sweet. Those who had disowned her, who had seen her as nothing more than a burden, were now unknowingly under her dominion. Her fingers tightened around the parchment, lightly creasing the ancient paper. A wave of emotions washed over her, the pain of expulsion, the humiliation, the silent rage she had harbored for so long, and now an overwhelming sense of triumph. What would she do with this truth? How would she reveal it? And more importantly, how would she wield this power that fate, or perhaps divine justice, had placed in her hands? Winter was still long, but the cold in her heart began to be replaced by a new fire, dangerous and promising. Ilara looked at her sleeping grandchildren, and a slow, determined smile formed on her lips. The game had changed. The dying firelight danced over the aged parchment, transforming the archaic words into twisting shadows, almost as if history itself were alive, whispering forgotten secrets. Ilara, her heart still hammering in her chest, felt the weight of the gold in her hands and the intoxicating power of the truth contained within the document. It was not just a treasure, it was a vengeance, a belated justice, a destiny rewritten. She looked at her sleeping grandchildren, their faces pale and serene in the dim light, and a wave of tenderness and fury washed over her. For them, she had endured humiliation, the biting cold, hunger. For them, she had refused to give up. And now, for them, she would make every one of those who had disowned them feel the weight of their own cruelty. The smile that formed on her lips was not one of joy, but of cold, relentless determination. The night dragged on, but sleep did not come to Ilara. Every crackle of the fire, every moan of the wind through the castle's crevices seemed to amplify the whirlwind of thoughts in her mind. She reread the parchment, the words engraving themselves into her memory. Granted by His Majesty, King Theron III, to the Valerius family and their legitimate descendants, complete dominion over Highstone Castle, the surrounding lands, and the village of Oakhaven, in perpetuity. Valerius, her deceased wife's surname. The name she had proudly adopted, and which was now the key to everything. The gold in the chest, though a fortune, was merely the means. The parchment was the end. It was the invisible crown she now bore, but how to use it? An abrupt revelation could cause chaos, perhaps even a revolt. The villagers, accustomed to their own hierarchy and their contempt for her, would not easily accept an expelled widow as their new lady. The tension would be palpable, the consequences unpredictable. Ilara knew that haste was the enemy of strategy. She needed a plan, one as meticulous as the spider web that covered the corners of the hall. First, survival. The gold would solve that. She could, with discretion, go to a neighboring village, far enough away that no one would recognize her, and buy supplies, food, blankets, tools, perhaps even a horse and cart. The boys needed warmth, food, security. The castle, however imposing, was still an icy ruin. Her eyes swept over the crumbling walls, the loose stones, the ceiling that in many places no longer existed. This place, one day, had been her wife's home, the cradle of her lineage. Now, it was a refuge for her and her grandchildren. But it would not be just a refuge. It would be her fortress, her starting point. She imagined the castle restored, the towers raised again, the banners of the Valerius family fluttering in the wind, a grand vision, almost impossible. But now, with the gold and the parchment, no longer a distant dream, but a tangible goal. The rage, which had slumbered for so long, began to simmer. The memory of the villagers' elders' faces, their scornful glances, the cruel words that condemned her to exile, all mingled with the image of the harsh winter that had almost claimed them. They had cast her aside like refuse, but fate, in its infinite irony, had crowned her. She needed allies, or at least information. The village of Oakhaven was not large, but it had its own secrets, its own loyalties. Who would be the current lord of the village? Who benefited from her absence? These were questions that needed answers before she could make her move. With the first grey light of dawn peeking through the castle's crevices, Ilara hid the chest and the parchment again under the slab, covering it with the loose stones. The secret was heavy, but it was also her armor. She was no longer the helpless widow, but the guardian of a legacy, the bearer of a truth that would shake Oakhaven to its foundations. Her grandchildren began to stir, rubbing their sleepy eyes. "Grandma, I'm hungry," said the youngest, his voice a whisper. Ilara smiled, a smile that hid a universe of plans and promises. "Don't worry, my little one. Soon we will have more than enough." The game had changed, yes, but the match was just beginning. And Ilara, the expelled widow, was ready to play. Winter was still long, but the cold in her heart had been replaced by a new fire, dangerous and promising. Vengeance, she knew, was a dish best served cold, and she had all the time in the world to prepare it. The sunlight, still weak and pale, barely managed to penetrate the heavy clouds covering the sky, but for Ilara, it was a new dawn, laden with a purpose that made her vibrate. Her grandchildren, still too young to grasp the magnitude of the turn in their destiny, awoke with the promise of food, a luxury they had not enjoyed for a long time. Ilara gave them the last portion of dry bread and water, her eyes fixed on theirs, a silent promise of better times. With the boys entertained in a corner of the hall, playing with stones and twigs, Ilara acted. With the same discretion with which she had discovered the treasure, she removed the stones from the hearth, revealing the chest and the parchment. The gold, once a distant dream, was now a tool. She selected a handful of coins, enough to seem like a small fortune for a widow, but not so much as to raise suspicion. She hid them in a worn leather pouch, tying it firmly to her waist beneath her threadbare clothes. The parchment, the true crown of her vengeance, was carefully rolled and stored in a secret compartment within the chest, beneath the remaining coins, before everything was sealed again under the stones. The secret was hers, and for now it would remain so. The decision to go to a distant village was not just a precaution, but a necessity. Oakhaven, the village that had cast her out, was a nest of curious glances and sharp tongues. She needed a place where her face would not be recognized, where her presence would not evoke painful memories or distrust. The village of Stonebridge, a 2-day walk along the mountain trail, was the chosen destination. It was a place she barely knew, a name whispered in tales, but its distance was its greatest virtue. The journey was arduous. The snow, which had been her enemy, was now a treacherous blanket hiding stones and holes. Every step was an effort, her muscles protesting, but the determination in her heart was a fire that propelled her. She thought of the boys, of the promise of warmth and food, and fatigue receded. She arrived in Stonebridge at dusk on the second day, exhausted, but with the pouch of gold still secure at her waist. Stonebridge was smaller than Oakhaven, but it seemed a paradise of activity compared to the castle's silence. The scent of fresh bread and hearth smoke filled the air, a long-forgotten fragrance. Elara, with her hood pulled up to cover her face, entered the small local tavern, her eyes observing every detail. The place was full of peasants and travellers, their voices mingling in a comforting hum. She ordered a bowl of stew and a cup of cider, feeling the warmth spread through her body. With her stomach warmed and her mind clearer, Elara approached the local merchant, a corpulent man with a friendly smile. She presented the gold coins with rehearsed caution, explaining they were an inheritance from a distant relative. The gleam of gold in the merchant's eyes was unmistakable. He accepted them without question, greed overcoming any curiosity. Elara's shopping list was long and essential. Sacks of flour, grains, salted meat, cheese, dried fruits, candles, thick wool blankets, a sharp axe, rope, and, most importantly, a sturdy sled and a pair of mules to pull it. She also bought warmer clothes for herself and the boys, replacing the rags that barely protected them from the cold. As the merchant stacked the supplies, Elara, in a casual voice, inquired about the news of the region. "Any news from Oakhaven?" she asked, trying to sound disinterested. The merchant shrugged. Oakhaven, always the same. Lord Kale continues to rule with an iron fist, and taxes only increase. They say he's pressing the peasants even harder to pay for his extravagances. Rumors are he's trying to buy more land, expand his dominion. Lord Kale. The name resonated in Elara's mind. He was one of the elders who had condemned her, a man of power and influence in the village. The irony was almost unbearable. He was expanding his dominion, unaware that the true dominion by right belonged to her. The tension in her chest tightened, but she maintained a neutral expression. "I see," she murmured, picking up a piece of fresh bread. "And the Valerius family? Are there any remnants left?" The merchant chuckled, a rough laugh. "Valerius? They vanished long ago, madam. The last one, poor Elara's wife, died years ago, and Elara herself was cast out last winter. A shame. They say the Valerius family had an ancient castle on the mountain, but it's been in ruins for centuries. Nobody cares about those old stories anymore." Elara felt a shiver run down her spine. They considered her dead, forgotten. Better this way. Her anonymity was her greatest advantage. She thanked the merchant and, with the help of a young villager, loaded the supplies onto the sled. The return journey would be easier with the mules, but the weight of the truth she carried was heavier than any load. Back at the castle, the reunion with her grandchildren was a balm for her weary soul. Their eyes shone at the sight of abundant food and soft blankets. The fire, now fed with dry wood, crackled merrily, and the scent of warm stew filled the hall. For the first time in months, they ate their fill, warmth and security enveloping them like an embrace. While the boys slept soundly, Elara sat by the fire, the parchment once again in her hands. Lord Kale. He would be the first to feel the weight of her justice. The village that had disowned her would now be hers. Vengeance, she knew, was a dish best served cold, and she had all the time in the world to prepare it. Winter was still long, but the fire in her heart now burned with a dangerous and promising intensity. She was no longer the helpless widow, but the queen of a forgotten realm, ready to claim what was hers by right. The scent of warm stew and the crackling fire were a melody to Elara's soul, a stark contrast to the icy silence that had been her companion for so long. Her grandchildren, finally fed and warm, slept deeply. Their childish faces relaxed in a slumber they hadn't known for months. The sight of them was the fuel that fed the fire in her chest, a fire that now burned with a dangerous and promising intensity. With the parchment in hand, Elara traced the ancient lines, the words that sealed her destiny and Oakhaven's. Lord Kale. The name echoed in her mind, a reminder of the man who, along with others, had orchestrated her downfall. He was the personification of the injustice she had suffered, and he would be the first to feel the weight of her retribution. But vengeance, she knew, was not an impulsive act, but an art that required patience, cunning, and impeccable strategy. The castle, though hers by right, was still a ruin. The first task was to make it habitable, a safe haven for the boys and a fortress for her plans. With dawn, Elara began to work. The newly acquired axe became an extension of her arm, cutting dry branches and fallen wood to feed the fire. She and the boys, now in warmer clothes, began to clear the main hall, stacking loose stones and sweeping away decades of accumulated grime. It was arduous work, but every piece of debris removed was a step towards restoration, an act of possession. The wool blankets were spread near the fire, creating a cozier sleeping space. The candles, lit at dusk, cast dancing shadows that sometimes seemed to bring the ancient walls to life, as if the spirits of the Valerius were watching, approving. Elara knew that the true restoration of the castle would take years, perhaps a lifetime, but the first steps were crucial. She needed a home, not just a shelter. In the days that followed, Elara established a routine. During the day, she worked tirelessly on the castle, the boys helping with lighter tasks, their laughter filling the silence that had once been oppressive. She explored the ruins, mentally mapping the rooms, the secret passages that might exist, the weak and strong points of the structure. The chest of gold and the parchment remained hidden beneath the hearth, her most precious secret, her source of power. At night, when the boys slept, Elara pored over the parchment, studying it by the flickering candlelight. The words were clear. The Valerius lineage was the rightful owner of Oakhaven and the surrounding lands. The document was irrefutable, but law and power did not always go hand in hand. Lord Kale held control. The guards, the loyalty or fear of the peasants. She needed more than just a piece of paper. She needed a strategy to dismantle his power without exposing herself prematurely. Information was her next weapon. She needed to know more about Lord Kale, about the village, about the people. How did he rule? Who were his allies? Who were his enemies? The merchant in Stonebridge had provided some clues, but they were superficial. Elara needed eyes and ears in Oakhaven. But as an expelled and now supposedly dead widow, she couldn't simply appear. The idea of a disguise began to take shape in her mind. She couldn't go alone, but perhaps she could send someone or find a way to infiltrate without being recognized. Winter, which had once seemed a curse, was now an ally. The cold and snow kept most people in their homes, and the desolate landscape offered a cloak of anonymity to anyone daring to brave it. Elara began to think about how she could use the gold for her strategic benefit, not just to buy supplies, but to buy information, perhaps even to buy loyalties. She had no illusions. Loyalty was a luxury few could afford, but gold could buy favors, and favors could turn into alliances. One afternoon, while the boys played near the fire, Elara noticed a crack in the main hall's wall, revealing a small cavity. Curious, she removed some loose stones and discovered a small hidden niche. Inside, there was an ancient map, rolled and yellowed by time, and a leather-bound diary. The map was of the castle and the surrounding lands, with notes about secret passages and underground caches. The diary, written in elegant script, belonged to Lady Isolde Valerius, her mother-in-law, the last lady of the castle before its final ruin. Isolde had detailed the family's history, their secrets, their alliances, and crucially, the tensions with the elders of Oakhaven, including Kale's grandfather. She had written about the castle's importance as a symbol of power and the need to protect it at all costs. The diary was a treasure trove of information, a bridge to the past that could light her path to the future. Ilara felt a shiver. She was not alone. Her family's legacy, Isolde's voice across time, was with her. Winter was still long, but the cold in her heart had been replaced by a new fire, dangerous and promising. She was no longer the helpless widow, but the guardian of a legacy, the bearer of a truth that would shake Oakhaven to its foundations. The game was just beginning, and Ilara, the forgotten queen, was ready to play. The shiver that ran down Ilara's spine was not from cold, but from the electricity of discovery. The ancient map, yellowed and fragile, unfolded in her hands, revealing not only the castle's contours, but also the surrounding lands, with enigmatic markings that seemed to indicate secret passages and underground caches. But it was the diary, bound in faded leather, that called to her with more urgency. The elegant script on the first page confirmed Lady Isolde Valerius, her mother-in-law, the last lady of the castle before silence and ruin swallowed it. Ilara felt an immediate connection, as if Isolde herself were there, watching her from the past. Her heart pounding, she lit another candle, its flickering light dancing over the pages as she began to read. The diary was not just a record, it was a bridge to the past, an echo of a voice that time had tried to silence. The first entries spoke of life in the castle, of the joy and prosperity of the Valerius family. Isolde described Oakhaven as a vibrant place, under the protection and justice of her ancestors. But as Ilara turned the pages, the tone shifted. Melancholy and concern began to seep into Isolde's words. She detailed the growing tensions with the village elders, men who, over time, had grown envious of the Valerius's power and influence. The name of Kyle, the current Lord Kyle's grandfather, appeared repeatedly, always associated with manipulations and malicious whispers. Isolde wrote about how the elders, led by Kyle, began to undermine the Valerius's authority. First, there were small disputes over hunting grounds, then false accusations of injustice and excessive taxes. Gradually, the loyalty of the peasants was eroded, not by force but by insidiousness, by empty promises and the spread of poisonous rumors. Ilara felt rage bubble in her chest. History was repeating itself. The same tactic of defamation and isolation that had led to her expulsion was there, in the pages of her mother-in-law's diary. The diary revealed that the Oakhaven elders didn't just want power, they wanted the Valerius wealth, and more importantly, the legitimacy that the castle and the royal title conferred. Isolde had recorded a series of events that culminated in her family's downfall. Crop sabotage attributed to the Valerius, manipulation of witnesses in legal disputes, and even the instigation of small revolts that forced the family to spend their fortune on defense and repairs. The castle, a symbol of their strength, became a financial burden, bleeding their resources until they could no longer defend themselves. The most painful entry for Ilara was the one describing the final affront, the falsification of documents, and the corruption of a local judge who declared the Valerius family in debt to the village, forcing them to abandon the castle under threat of imprisonment and total expropriation. Isolde had written about the pain of seeing her home taken, the humiliation of being expelled from her own lands, but also about hope. She had hidden the royal parchment and the chest of gold, not just to protect them, but as a legacy, a weapon for a future heir who might one day reclaim what was theirs by right. The castle is not just stone and mortar, Isolde had written in one of her last entries. It is the heart of Oakhaven. Whoever possesses it possesses the village, but true power lies in truth, and truth is hidden. May one day a worthy Valerius find these words and use them to ignite the flame of justice. Isolde's words were a beacon in the darkness, illuminating not only the past, but also the path ahead. Ilara understood that the chest of gold was not just an inheritance, it was a war chest. The parchment was not just a title, it was irrefutable proof of a historical injustice. And the diary was the instruction manual, revealing the enemies, their tactics, and their weaknesses. With the diary in one hand and the map in the other, Ilara began to connect the dots. Isolde's notes about escape passages in case of siege corresponded to dashed lines on the map that led to underground tunnels, some of which seemed to extend beyond the castle walls towards the forest. There were also markings for emergency supply caches, suggesting that the castle might have more secrets to reveal, more hidden resources that could be vital to her cause. Ilara's rage transformed into a cold, calculated determination. She was no longer just a widow seeking personal revenge. She was the guardian of a legacy, the bearer of a truth that would shake Oakhaven to its foundations. Lord Kael and the other elders had built their empire on lies and betrayals, and now she had the tools to dismantle it. Winter was still long, but the cold in her heart had been replaced by a new fire, dangerous and promising. Ilara was no longer the helpless widow, but the queen of a forgotten realm, ready to claim what was hers by right. The game was just beginning, and Ilara, with Isolde's knowledge as her guide, was ready to play. She closed the diary, her gaze fixed on the map. Every line and every word a piece of the puzzle she was now determined to solve. Justice would be served, and it would be as cold as the winter that protected her. The days that followed were a fever of silent discoveries. Ilara delved into Isolde's map and diary, her mother-in-law's words echoing in her mind like a tragic lament of betrayal and loss. She saw her own fate mirrored in the downfall of her ancestors, a cruel repetition orchestrated by the same greedy lineage. The map, once a yellowed parchment, became a living document, every faded line and symbol whispering secrets of a forgotten era. Among the many markings for hidden chambers and forgotten caches, one passage in particular, marked with a faded X and a small intricate symbol resembling the Valerius crest, drew her gaze repeatedly. It snaked away from the castle's foundations, deep beneath the earth, and, according to Isolde's elegant script, emerged in an isolated clearing in the heart of the ancient forest, far from Oakhaven's curious eyes. This was more than an escape route. It was a lifeline, a secret artery connecting her isolated stronghold to the world she intended to reclaim. Ilara waited until the boys were deeply asleep, their innocent dreams a stark contrast to the dark resolve hardening her own heart. Armed with a single torch, a small shovel, and a growing sense of purpose, Ilara descended into the cold, damp darkness indicated on the map. The air grew heavy, dense, with the smell of damp earth and forgotten time. The passage was narrow, barely wide enough for her shoulders, the rough, uneven stones slippery with moisture. Each step echoed ominously, swallowed by the oppressive silence. She followed the faint markings Isolde had carved into the stone walls, a silent guide through the labyrinth. The journey was arduous. She crawled through collapsed sections, cleared debris, and pushed aside ancient rotting timbers. The torchlight flickered, casting dancing shadows that played tricks on her eyes, making her imagine dangers lurking in every recess. But the thought of Isolde, her silent companion, propelled her forward. This was her legacy, her fight. After what felt like an eternity, the passage widened into a small circular chamber. The air here was surprisingly dry, and a faint, musty smell of ancient parchment hung in the air. In the center, a rustic wooden table stood, surprisingly intact, and against one wall, shelves carved directly into the rock held a collection of items. Ilara raised her torch, her breath catching in her throat. This was no mere supply depot. This was Isolde's secret vault, a time capsule of the Valerius' last stand. On the table lay a rolled parchment, larger than the royal deed, and beside it, a stack of leather-bound ledgers. The shelves held no food, but more books, some small, intricately carved wooden boxes, and a few rusted but still recognizable tools. She carefully unrolled the large parchment. It was a detailed map of Oakhaven itself, far more precise than any she had ever seen. Every house, every field, every path was meticulously drawn, and crucially, several buildings were marked with small, almost invisible symbols. Isolde's elegant script, now familiar, explained marks of loyalty and debt. Some symbols indicated families still loyal to the Valerius, others, families deeply indebted to the Kyle family, often through usury and coercion. This was a social map, a blueprint of the village's power dynamics, a weapon of unparalleled discernment. Next, she opened the ledgers. They were filled with meticulous records, not of the Valerius finances, but of the Kale family's dealings. Isolde had painstakingly documented every fraudulent transaction, every land appropriation, every usurious loan that slowly strangled the Valerius family and enslaved the villagers. Dates, names, values. It was all there, a damning indictment of generations of corruption. One entry in particular made Ilara's blood run cold. A detailed account of how Kale's grandfather had manipulated the local council and bribed the royal magistrate to declare the Valerius family bankrupt, paving the way for their expulsion. The very act that had stripped her wife's family of their home and title was laid bare with undeniable proof. Among the smaller books, she found a collection of letters, faded and fragile, exchanged between Isolde and a network of sympathetic individuals outside Oakhaven, a traveling merchant, a distant noble, even a former guard disillusioned with Kyle's tyranny. These letters spoke of a hidden resistance, a whisper of hope that the Valerius name might one day resurface. They contained coded messages, warnings, and even suggestions on how to rally support should the time come. Ilara's hands trembled, not from cold, but from the weight of the truth she held. Isolde had foreseen everything. She had not just hidden a treasure, she had built an arsenal of information, a meticulously crafted trap for her enemies, waiting for the right moment, the right person, to activate it. The rusted tools on the shelves were simple, yet effective. A small pickaxe, a set of lockpicking tools, and a sharp, well-maintained hunting knife, practical items for survival and infiltration. Ilara spent hours in that hidden chamber, devouring every word, tracing every line on the map. The cold, damp air of the tunnel no longer bothered her. She felt connected to Isolde, a silent pact across generations. The pieces of the puzzle were fitting together with terrifying clarity. Lord Kale's power was not absolute. It was built on a foundation of lies and fear, and she now held the keys to expose every one of them. Winter was still long, but the cold in her heart had been replaced by a new fire, dangerous and promising. Ilara was no longer the helpless widow, but the queen of a forgotten realm, ready to claim what was hers by right. The game was just beginning, and Ilara, with Isolde's knowledge as her guide, was ready to play. She closed the diary, her gaze fixed on the map, every line and every word a piece of the puzzle she was now determined to solve. Justice would be served, and it would be as cold as the winter that protected her. The cold air of the secret chamber was no longer a discomfort for Ilara, it was a catalyst. The hours that followed the discovery of Isolde's vault were a silent whirlwind of revelations. She was not merely unraveling a mystery, she was inheriting a war. The weight of the parchments, ledgers, and letters was almost unbearable, but with it came an icy clarity, a determination she had never before felt. Ilara spent the night in the chamber, illuminated by the flickering torch, organizing Isolde's arsenal. Oakhaven's social map was the first to be studied. She traced the lines of loyalties and debts, seeing the village not as a cluster of houses, but as a complex web of power relations. The small symbols, once enigmatic, were now beacons. Families marked with the Valerius crest, still loyal, and those with the debt symbol caught in Kyle's net. She began to memorize the names. The faces she had once known in passing, now revealed as pawns or potential allies. The ledgers were an even more potent accusation. Every page turned was a blow against Lord Kael's facade of respectability. She saw the names of her neighbors, her friends, her own parents, trapped in usurious loans, lands confiscated under false pretenses, entire families ruined by insatiable greed. The entry about the Valerius bankruptcy, the final blow orchestrated by Kael's grandfather, burned in her mind. It was not just an injustice, it was a meticulously documented crime, with dates, values, and witnesses implicit in the records. The letters from the resistance network were the most delicate part. Written in simple but effective codes, they spoke of secret meetings, exchanged information, and a faint hope that persisted in the shadows. A fur merchant who traveled beyond the mountains, an old scribe in a distant town who kept land records, even a former guard of Kael's own, disillusioned with the tyranny. These were not just names. They were links, bridges to an outside world she had thought lost forever. Isolde had not merely dreamed of justice, she had sown the seeds for it. With the first light of dawn, peeking through the passage's crevices, Elara made her way back. The weariness was deep, but her mind was more awake than ever. She hid the new documents with the same care Isolde would have taken, beneath the loose stones of the hearth, beside the chest of gold and the royal deed. Isolde's diary, now her primary guide, remained at hand. The days that followed were a routine of dissimulation and study. While the boys played innocently in the castle rooms, oblivious to the secret arsenal beneath their feet, Elara delved into the details. She practiced with the lock-picking tools, feeling the weight of the pickaxe and the balance of the hunting knife. Her hands, once calloused by domestic work and the earth, now learned a new language, the language of survival and infiltration. She used the pickaxe to test the walls, searching for other compartments the map might have omitted or that Isolde hadn't had time to mark. Each night, after the boys fell asleep, Elara returned to the secret chamber or pored over Oakhaven's map, tracing routes, identifying weak points in Kyle's defense, imagining how the information from the ledgers could be used to turn the villagers against their oppressor. She began to create her own diary, a complement to Isolde's, where she noted her thoughts, her plans, and her observations. She knew she needed more than just information. She needed an action plan, a timeline, and above all, allies. Winter was her greatest ally and her greatest enemy. The deep snow isolated the castle, giving her time to train and plan undetected. No one would venture up the mountain in the current conditions, but isolation also meant she was alone, with no one to trust, no one to share the immense burden she now carried. Loneliness was a constant companion, but Elara's determination was stronger. One night, while studying the map, a detail caught her attention. A small, almost imperceptible mark near the edge of the forest corresponded to a note in Isolde's diary about an ancient observation post used by the Valerius in times of war. It wasn't a secret passage, but a strategic point, a place from which one could observe the village unseen. It could be her first step outside the castle walls, a silent reconnaissance of enemy territory. The thought of leaving the boys alone, even for a few hours, tugged at her heart. But Isolde's voice, echoing in the diary's pages, reminded her that this fight was for them, for their future, so they would not suffer the same fate as her family. Elara knew she needed to be cautious, every move calculated. The chess game Isolde had started generations ago was now in her hands, and she could not afford to make a mistake. The biting cold of winter was a constant reminder of her vulnerability, but also of her strength. Elara, the helpless widow, had died in the snow. In her place, a new woman had emerged, forged in the fire of betrayal and tempered by truth. She was ready for war, not with swords and shields, but with secrets and proofs. With the cunning of a fox and the patience of a mountain, Oakhaven would be hers again, and justice, finally, would be served. She closed the diary, her gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the window, where the village slept, oblivious to the approaching storm. The match was just beginning. Winter, with its merciless white mantle, was a master of disguises. To the outside world, the abandoned castle atop the mountain was merely a dark silhouette against the grey sky, an icy reminder of a forgotten past. But within its walls, Ilara was forging a future. The decision to visit the ancient observation post was not taken lightly. Every step outside the gates would be a risk, a breach in her fortress of isolation. But Isolde had made it clear. Knowledge was power, and power demanded action. On the chosen morning, the air was exceptionally calm, which for Ilara was an ambiguous sign. Less wind meant less danger of sudden blizzards, but also a silence that amplified every crunch of snow beneath her feet. She donned the warmest clothes she could find, layers of thick wool and furs, and laced up the heavy boots Isolde had left. The hunting dagger, sharp and cold, was carefully tucked into her belt, a comforting and menacing presence. Before leaving, she went to the boys' rooms. They slept deeply, small forms beneath the blankets, oblivious to their mother's dangerous mission. Ilara's heart ached. The guilt of leaving them, even for a few hours, was a burden almost as heavy as the plan she carried. But Isolde's gaze, which seemed to emanate from the diary's pages, reminded her that this was the only way to ensure they had a future, a home, an inheritance. A soft kiss on each forehead, a silent prayer, and she turned, determination hardening her resolve. Her departure from the castle was an act of stealth. The rarely used service door creaked just enough for her to slip through, and then the mountain silence swallowed her. Virgin snow stretched before her, an untouched carpet that would register every one of her steps. She followed Isolde's map instructions, which indicated a less steep but more winding path through a grove of gnarled pines. The cold bit at her cheeks and fingers, but adrenaline kept her body warm. She was no longer the fragile widow who had been cast out. She was a hunter, moving with purpose, her senses sharpened by necessity. The journey to the observation post was arduous. The snow reached her knees in some places, and the uneven terrain demanded caution with every step. The forest's silence was broken only by the sound of her own breathing and the creaking of trees under the weight of the snow. She imagined Isolde making the same journey, perhaps with a similar purpose, centuries ago. This connection to the past, to the lineage of Valerius women who had fought for their land, gave her strength. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, she spotted the rock formation Isolde had marked. It wasn't a tower, but a natural outcrop, shielded by dense pines and offering an unobstructed view of the valley below. A small, barely visible recess in the rock offered shelter from the wind. Ilara hid among the trees, observing the village. From there, Oakhaven looked like a miniature toy, its houses clustered like small sugar cubes, sprinkled with snow. The flickering lights from the windows were golden dots in the deepening darkness, each a reminder of what had been taken from her. She took out the small brass spyglass Isolde had left in the secret chamber. With it, the distance shrank and details began to emerge. She could see Kyle's patrols, men armed with torches, marching through the main streets, a constant reminder of his authority. She observed their movement patterns, the routes they avoided, the points where vigilance seemed weakest. One scene in particular caught her attention. Near the market square, a group of villagers was gathered, and one of Kyle's guards seemed to be collecting something from them. It wasn't a common transaction. There was an air of resignation on the villagers' faces, a hurried gesture of handing over small coins or goods. It was tax collection, no doubt, but with a brutality Ilara didn't remember seeing before. Kyle's greed was tightening its grip on the people even further. Rage boiled within her, but she controlled it, transforming it into cold determination. Those faces, those gestures of submission, were why she was there. She spent hours at the observation post, mentally mapping the village, comparing what she saw with Isolde's map. Isolde's markings about loyalties and debts began to make sense. She could identify the homes of families Isolde had marked as loyal Valerius. They were the ones that appeared darkest, their lights scarcest, perhaps in a silent act of defiance or impoverishment. And the homes of Kale's debtors seemed to have more activity, perhaps because they were more under the Lord's scrutiny. The sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple, and Ilara knew it was time to return. Darkness would bring with it an even more intense cold, and the nocturnal dangers of the mountain. The journey back was quicker, fueled by a new sense of urgency and clarity. She had seen Oakhaven not as a victim, but as a chessboard, and she now had a deeper understanding of its pieces. Upon returning to the castle, the relief of being back in safety and finding her children still sleeping peacefully was immense. But the loneliness that had accompanied her going and coming was no longer so oppressive. She had taken the first step. She had emerged from her prison of snow and fear and had confronted the enemy, if only with her eyes. What she had seen confirmed her suspicions and hardened her resolve. Kyle was not just a usurper, he was a tyrant, and the people of Oakhaven were suffering under his yoke. Ilara lit a candle in the secret chamber, its weak warmth dancing on the stone walls. She took Isolde's diary and began to write in her own journal, alongside her ancestors' thoughts. "Oakhaven is sick," she wrote, "and Kale is the sickness. But I have the cure, and now I know where the heart of the sickness resides." The tension had not lessened. It had merely changed form. From a paralyzing anxiety to focused determination. The chess game had begun, and Ilara had made her first move. Winter was still her shield, but now she knew exactly where and how she would strike when spring arrived. The night's cold seemed more penetrating after the warmth of revelation. Ilara was back in the secret chamber, the candle flickering, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. The words she had written in her diary, alongside Isolde's, were a silent oath. "Oakhaven is sick, and Kyle is the sickness. But I have the cure, and now I know where the heart of the sickness resides." The cure, she knew, would not be easy. It would be painful, dangerous, and would demand every ounce of her newfound strength. She ran her hands over Isolde's diary, feeling the weight of history, the weight of responsibility. Her observation of the village had confirmed her worst suspicions. Kyle was not just a usurper, he was a parasite, sucking the life out of Oakhaven, leaving the people in despair. Those resigned faces, the hurried gestures of handing over coins, echoed in her mind. They were her people, her heritage, and they were suffering. The night wore on. But sleep was a luxury Ilara could not afford. She needed more. She needed a battle map, not just a terrain map. She returned to Isolde's diary, flipping through the pages with a new urgency. Now that she had seen the village with her own eyes, Isolde's notes gained a chilling clarity. The markings about loyalties and debts were not just names, they were lives, families, stories intertwined with the Valerius lineage. Isolde had been meticulous. Beyond the names, there were small, almost imperceptible symbols drawn beside certain entries. A small oak branch for the loyal, a spiderweb for Kale's informants, a crossed dagger for those who owed a debt of blood or honor to the Valerius. Ilara realized that Isolde was not just recording history. She was building a network, a contingency plan for a day like this. Ilara's heart quickened. Those symbols were not just information, they were keys. Keys to hearts, to doors, to secrets. She picked up the village map again, comparing it with the diary's notes. The houses Isolde had marked as loyal Valerius were indeed the darkest, the quietest, as if in perpetual mourning. And the houses with the crossed dagger symbol. They were few, but strategically located, often near Kyle's patrol routes, or in positions that could offer a tactical advantage. Debt of honor, Ilara whispered to herself. Isolde had written about it in an older section of the diary, detailing how the Valerius family had, over centuries, helped certain families in times of great need, creating unbreakable bonds of loyalty and gratitude. These families had sworn to protect the Valerius and their heritage, even with their own lives. But how to contact them? How to know if they still honored their oaths after so many years of Kyle's oppression? The village was under constant surveillance. One wrong move, one misplaced word, and all would be lost. The thought of leaving the boys again, of venturing into the village, was terrifying. But Isolde's voice, now an almost tangible presence, insisted, "Knowledge is power, but action is the sword." Ilara found a passage in the diary that detailed a discreet communication system used in times of war or crisis. These were not written messages, but subtle signs, objects left in specific locations, known only to the loyal. A small arrangement of stones by the riverbank, a specific scarf hung in a window, a pattern of lights at night. It was a code, a silent language that had been passed down through generations. One of these signs caught her attention, a small clay pot with a specific flower left in the window of a particular house, the home of the master blacksmith, a man named Theron. Isolde had noted that Theron's family had an ancient and deep debt of honor to the Valerius, and that the master blacksmith was a man of few words, but great integrity and strength. He was one of the few who still kept his forge active, even under Kyle's yoke, producing essential tools and repairs for the village. His house, Ilara noted on the map, was near the market square, but on a side street, a little more isolated. The idea of using this code, of exposing herself, was a leap into the dark, but the alternative was inaction, and inaction meant defeat. Ilara began to plan. She needed a clay pot, a specific flower, and a way to reach Theron's house undetected. Winter, which had once been her shield, now seemed like a clock, its days dwindling. The snow beginning to yield in some places, revealing the damp earth beneath. Spring was approaching, and with it, the window of opportunity to act would open. The following days were filled with a new kind of training. It was not just physical, but mental. She studied the map, memorized Kyle's patrol patterns, mentally rehearsed every step, every movement. She practiced stealth within the castle walls, moving like a shadow, sharpening her senses. She even found a small, ancient clay pot in the castle pantry, and Isolde had left a botany book with detailed drawings of the region's flowers. The specific flower, a rare bluebell that bloomed in late winter, was the key. Tension mounted with each day. The sun lingered a little longer in the sky. Ilara knew her time was running out. Loneliness was still a companion, but now she had a clear purpose, a plan emerging from the shadows of the past. She was no longer just a grieving widow. She was the heir to a lineage, the bearer of a truth, and the strategist of a silent revolution. Oakhaven waited, and Ilara was ready to make her second move, a move that could seal the fate of all. Winter, once a protective cloak, now seemed an relentless timer. Ilara felt the imminent thaw in her bones, the promise of a spring that would bring not only new life, but also the urgent need for action. The following days were a frantic dance between study and preparation. She had found the perfect clay pot, a small ancient vessel in the castle pantry, with the patina of time etched into its surface. And the flower, The bluebell, rare and resilient, bloomed in winter's last gasps, a miracle of blue delicacy against the retreating snow. Ilara had scoured the mountain's most sheltered slopes, following Isolde's detailed diary descriptions until she found a small cluster of them, hidden beneath an overhanging rock. Plucking it was an act of faith, a sacrifice of its wild beauty for a greater purpose. The night of the mission arrived, laden with biting cold and almost absolute darkness. Ilara donned the darkest clothes she owned, layers of thick wool that camouflaged and protected her from the ice. Her children slept deeply, oblivious to the danger their mother was about to face. Leaving them was a silent agony, a twisted knife in her chest. But the image of the villagers' resigned faces, the brutality of Kyle's tax collection burned in her mind, fueling her determination. The descent down the mountain was a test of her newfound strength and agility. The snow, now more compact and slippery in some stretches, demanded every fiber of her being. She moved like a shadow, her steps light and calculated. The clay pot with the bluebell carefully protected beneath her cloak. The icy air cut at her face, but the adrenaline coursing through her veins kept her warm. Every tree, every rock, every shadow seemed a potential observer, a hidden danger. Her senses were sharpened, catching the distant rustle of dry leaves, the howl of the wind, the damp scent of the awakening earth. As she approached the village, the darkness grew even denser, punctuated only by a few flickering lights in the windows. Oakhaven, seen up close, was a place of oppressive silence, a stark contrast to the bustle she remembered. The streets were deserted. Kyle's curfew was a palpable presence, stifling any trace of nightlife. Ilara crept through the narrow alleys, using the shadows as her disguise. The sound of her own footsteps seemed amplified in the silence, every breath a risk. She could feel the village's invisible eyes upon her, Kyle's paranoia extending like a web over every stone, every door. Isolde's map was her guide, every curve, every alley, every landmark etched into her memory. She avoided the market square, the heart of Kyle's vigilance, and moved through the side streets, where houses were older and shadows deeper. The scent of wood smoke and curiously hot metal began to intensify. It was the smell of Theron's forge, still active, a sign of his resilience. The master blacksmith's house was modest, of dark stone with a sloping roof, nestled in a quiet corner of a side street. A single faint light glowed from an upstairs window, but the forge downstairs was dark and silent. Ilara approached cautiously, her heart beating like a drum in her chest. She could feel the residual heat from the forge, a reminder of the life that persisted there. With trembling but steady hands, Ilara withdrew the clay pot with the bluebell from beneath her cloak. She carefully placed it on the forge's windowsill, a visible but not ostentatious spot. The flower's vibrant blue seemed almost unreal against the dark stone. It was a sign, a silent question, a fragile hope. She lingered only for an instant, just long enough for the flower's image to imprint itself on her mind, before turning and retreating into the shadows. The journey back was a mix of relief and anxiety. She had done what seemed impossible. She had exposed herself. She had planted the seed of her revolution. But the answer was still unknown. Would Theron see the sign? Would he remember the ancient code? Would he still honor his family's debt? Uncertainty was a cold mist that enveloped her. Upon returning to the castle, exhausted and chilled, Ilara allowed herself a sigh of relief upon seeing her children still asleep. She lit a candle in the secret chamber, its weak warmth a balm for her soul. In her diary she wrote, "The signal has been given. The chess game continues. Now, the wait." Winter was still her shield, but spring was approaching, and with it, the promise of an answer or a silence that would seal Oakhaven's fate. She had made her second move, and now the board was in Theron's hands. The weight. Ah, the weight. It was a torment more cruel than the icy descent down the mountain, more insidious than the fear of discovery. Every sunbeam that squeezed through the castle's crevices, every shadow that lengthened with the passing hours, was a reminder of time slipping away. Ilara constantly found herself at the window, her eyes sweeping the village below, searching for a sign, any indication that her message had been received, understood. Theron's house, the master blacksmith, was a tiny, distant dot, but her mind magnified it, brought it to the foreground, scrutinizing every detail. Days dragged on, heavy and silent. The clay pot with the bluebell, a vibrant splash of color against the dark stone windowsill, seemed to mock her with its immobility. Had Theron seen it? Had he recognized it? Or had fear, Chaol's oppression, stifled the last ember of loyalty in his heart? Ilara felt the weight of history, Isolde's promise, Oakhaven's destiny, all resting on that small pot, that solitary flower. She tried to keep busy, reviewing maps, reading and rereading Isolde's diary, as if the words could offer a new clue, a guarantee. But the truth was, she had made her move. The board was now in Theron's hands. With each of Chaol's patrols she observed from the castle heights, with each group of villagers she saw coerced for taxes, the urgency grew. Chaol showed no signs of weakness. On the contrary, with spring approaching, his patrols seemed more frequent, his men more vigilant, as if sensing a change in the air. Winter, once her ally, now transformed into an enemy, melting natural barriers, opening pathways for Chaol's eyes and ears. The castle's solitude was a double-edged sword. It offered safety, but also amplified her doubts, her fears. Her children, oblivious to the brewing storm, were her only solace, her reason to persist. She watched them play, imagining a future where they could laugh freely without Chaol's shadow looming over their lives. This vision was the fuel that kept her flame alive, even when hope seemed to falter. On the 5th day after her nocturnal mission, as the afternoon sun began to dip, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple, Ilara was again at the window, a cup of cold tea in her hands. Her eyes, already accustomed to scanning the village, fixed on Theron's house. The pot was still there, the bluebell slightly wilted, but still visible, and then she saw it. It wasn't a dramatic change, not an obvious sign anyone could notice. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to an untrained eye. On the windowsill beside the clay pot, there was now a small sliver of metal. It wasn't a common piece of iron, but a fragment of polished steel, gleaming faintly under the dying light. And it wasn't just a sliver, it was shaped with a sharp edge and a small leaf-shaped notch, almost like a miniature arrowhead. Ilara held her breath. She remembered a passage in Isolde's diary, one that described one of the oldest codes. When the forge speaks, it is with singing metal. A leaf of steel, polished and carved, means the wait is long, but the blade is ready. Ilara's heart leaped. It wasn't an immediate acceptance, not a promise of immediate action. It was a confirmation. Theron had seen, Theron had understood, and more importantly, Theron had responded. The ready blade meant he was prepared, that his family's loyalty still burned, even under the ashes of oppression. But the wait is long was also a warning. He would not act rashly. He was a cautious man, a survivor. A wave of relief and a new surge of determination swept over Ilara. The fog of uncertainty dissipated, replaced by an icy clarity. Theron was with her. But how to continue communication? Isolde's diary held the answer. The next stage of the code involved a pattern of lights in the castle window, visible only from certain points in the village, including Theron's forge. A signal of 3 slow blinks, followed by 2 quick ones, meant time is short, seek the messenger. Ilara knew she needed to be even more careful. A pattern of lights was riskier than a clay pot. But Theron's message, the ready blade, encouraged her. He was willing to take risks, but in his own way, she needed to honor that. Night fell, and with it, the deep darkness that was her ally. Ilara lit a candle in the secret chamber, its weak warmth a balm for her soul. She picked up Isolde's diary again, her hands tracing the ancient words. "The messenger," she whispered. Who would the messenger be? The diary described a system of silent messengers, people who moved through the village without raising suspicion, carrying small objects or coded information. The next step was not for her to go to the village, but for Theron to send someone, and the signal for that was the pattern of lights. Ilara spent the rest of the night planning. She needed a location in the castle from which the light signal could be clearly seen by Theron, but that was discreet enough not to alert Kael. The highest tower, abandoned and in ruins, seemed the most logical option. She would need a lantern or a shielded candle, and a means to flash the light with precision. The tension was back, but now it was a different kind of tension, laden with purpose. She was no longer waiting in the dark, she was acting in the dark. Spring was almost here, and with it, the promise of a silent revolution that was beginning to take shape, one signal at a time. Ilara was the heir to a lineage, the bearer of a truth, and the conductor of an orchestra of whispers and signs, ready to awaken Oakhaven from its forced slumber. The next move would be hers, and it would be made under the cloak of night, a light in the darkness, a hope for the loyal. The icy clarity that followed the discovery of Theron's signal was a balm, but also a new burden. The wait was over, but action was imperative. Ilara knew that the next move was hers, and that it carried an even greater risk. A pattern of lights, visible from the village, was a beacon in the darkness, but also a target. Kael was no fool. His eyes and ears were everywhere, and any anomaly would be noticed. She spent the next day in a silent frenzy of preparation. Isolde's diary was her manual, each page a whisper from the past. The castle's highest tower, a forgotten ruin in the most remote corner, was the ideal location. Its broken windows offered an unobstructed view of the village, and its isolated position made it less likely to be patrolled by the guards Kael had left behind, who were more concerned with the main accesses. Finding a lantern was the first task. Candles were fragile, and their flame too weak to be seen from a distance. She scoured the dusty cellars, among cobwebs and sheet-draped furniture, until her fingers found the cold metal of an ancient iron lantern. It was rusted, but intact. With a little oil and a new wick, she managed to light it. The yellowish light that emanated was dim, but constant, and with the right shield, it could be controlled. The shield. She needed something that could quickly cover and uncover the light, without making a sound. A piece of dark, thick cloth found in a chest of old clothes served perfectly. She tested it in the secret chamber, practicing the rhythm. 3 slow blinks, followed by 2 quick ones. Timing was crucial, precision vital. Every movement of the cloth, every second of exposed light, was a word in the silent code. Night fell, bringing with it a biting wind that howled through the castle's crevices. Ilara waited until her children were deeply asleep, their small bodies nestled under the blankets. The thought of leaving them, even for a brief moment, squeezed her heart, but it was for them that she did this, for a future where they could live without fear. With the lantern lit and the dark cloth held firmly, she began her ascent. The tower was a labyrinth of spiral stairs, broken steps, and rubble. The air was dense with the smell of mold and ancient stone. Every step was cautious, her feet fumbling in the dark, avoiding holes and loose stones. The wind whipped through the openings, making the lantern flicker and shadows dance like ghosts. She could feel the dampness of the stone, the cold penetrating her clothes. Upon reaching the top, the wind was a violent force, threatening to tear her from the parapet. The view was breathtaking, but there was no time for admiration. Below, Oakhaven slept, a cluster of faint lights and deep shadows. Theron's Forge was a dark, almost invisible spot, but Elara knew exactly where it was. She positioned herself at one of the broken windows, shielded by a piece of wall that still stood. The icy wind bit at her exposed skin, but she ignored the discomfort. Her eyes were fixed on the village, her ears alert to any sound that might indicate a patrol. The night silence was almost absolute, broken only by the wind's howl and the accelerated beat of her own heart. Taking a deep breath, Elara raised the lantern. Her fingers trembled slightly, but her determination was unshakable. She covered the light with the cloth, waited a moment, and then removed it. A slow blink covered it again, another slow blink, and one more. 3 slow blinks, the message of urgency echoing in the cold air. Then, with a quicker movement, 2 short, rapid blinks. The pattern was complete. She repeated the process. 3 slow, 2 quick, once more to ensure the message was seen and understood. Each time the lantern's light revealed itself, Elara felt a pang of vulnerability, as if she were shouting her presence to the world. But she also felt a power, the strength of a truth that refused to be silenced. When she finished, she kept the lantern covered, waiting. The wind continued to howl, and the cold seemed to intensify. She swept the village with her eyes, searching for any sign that her message had been received. There was no immediate response, nor could there be. The next stage was the wait again. But this time, the wait for a messenger. The descent from the tower was as dangerous as the ascent, but Elara was lighter, more focused. She had made her move. The seed had been planted, and now the water had been added. Spring was approaching, and with it, the promise of an awakening. Back in the secret chamber, the candle's warmth was a welcome comfort. She wrote in her diary, her hands still trembling slightly, "The signal has been sent. The light shone in the darkness. Now we await the messenger. Time is short, but hope is stronger than fear." She knew that Kyle would intensify his vigilance with the melting snow. Winter had been her shield, but spring would be her battlefield. Isolde's network, dormant for generations, was beginning to weave itself anew, one thread at a time. Theron had responded. Now someone would come, someone who would move through Oakhaven's streets, a whisper in the crowd, a crucial link in the chain she was forging. The question was not if the messenger would come, but who they would be, and what they would bring. The tension was a taut string, ready to vibrate with the next touch. The night Elara lit the light in the tower was a watershed. It was no longer passive waiting, but active, waiting for the response to an audacious move. Every shadow dancing on the secret chamber walls seemed a threat, every creak of the castle an approaching step. She knew she had exposed herself. The light, however brief, was a beacon, and beacons attract gazes. The days that followed were a silent torture. Elara maintained the facade of a reclusive widow, caring for her children, but her senses were sharpened, every nerve on alert. She watched the village from afar, through the crevices of the highest windows, searching for any sign of change, any unusual movement. Kale's guards seemed more numerous, their patrols more frequent, especially around the paths leading to Theron's Forge. It was subtle vigilance, but perceptible to one who knew what to look for. The melting snow, which once promised freedom, now revealed more than it hid, stripping bare the landscape and with it Kyle's intentions. In her heart, Elara felt a mix of hope and dread. Theron had responded to the first sign. He was loyal, but the wait is long, and his caution were a constant reminder of the risks. Who would he send? How would the messenger find her without raising suspicion? Isolde's diary was clear. The messenger will come when the wind changes, and will bring with them the smell of wet earth and the promise of a new cycle. A metaphor, she knew, for spring, for a time of renewal and less apparent vigilance when people moved more freely. But spring was already knocking at the door. A week dragged on, then another. Ilara's tension was almost palpable. She slept little, her dreams populated by flickering lights and whispers in the wind. Her children, oblivious to the brewing storm, were her anchor, the reason for her courage. She told them stories of ancient heroes, of lost kingdoms and justice that always prevailed, planting seeds of hope in their young hearts, while preparing the ground for the battle that approached. It was on a grey afternoon, as a fine drizzle fell, washing the last patches of snow from the courtyard, that the sign came. Ilara was in the kitchen, preparing a simple broth, when she heard an unusual sound. It wasn't a guard, nor the wind. It was a song, a soft, ancient melody, almost a lament coming from the back of the castle, near the ruins of the chapel. She recognized it immediately. It was a lullaby Isolde had written in her diary, a song Ilara had read and reread, a melody that, according to the diary, was used by messengers to identify themselves. When the mother's song echoes in the stone, the messenger is near. Ilara's heart pounded. She let the spoon fall to the floor with a dull thud. Her children were in the secret chamber, playing. She had to go. With one last glance at the chamber door, she ran to the back of the castle, her steps light and swift. The drizzle wet her face, but she didn't feel the cold. The melody guided her, each note a tug at her soul. As she approached the chapel ruins, she saw her. A small, hunched figure dressed in a grey wool cloak sat on a moss-covered stone bench. It was an elderly woman, her face wrinkled by time and her hands calloused. She held a wicker basket full of herbs and roots, as if she had just gathered them from the forest. Her eyes, however, were sharp and intelligent, and when she lifted her head, Ilara felt a shock of recognition. It was Eliana, the old village healer, a woman everyone considered harmless and a little eccentric. No one would ever suspect her. Eliana stopped singing as Ilara approached. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. "The earth needs healing, my dear," Eliana said, her voice hoarse but firm. "And sometimes the bitterest herbs are those that bring the deepest cure." Ilara understood. It was the password. She knelt beside Eliana, pretending to examine the herbs in the basket. "And what herbs did you find today, Eliana?" she asked, keeping her voice calm, though her insides churned. Eliana extended her hand, and between her wrinkled fingers, Ilara saw a small object. It was not an herb, but a polished wooden sliver, engraved with a familiar symbol. The carved leaf, the same symbol Theron had left at the forge. But this leaf had an extra detail, a small red dot of ink in its center. "This is the leaf of courage," Eliana whispered. "It blooms even in the harshest winter." Ilara took the wooden sliver, the red dot. She remembered another passage in Isolde's diary. "When the leaf bleeds, the time is now. The messenger will bring the key, and the key will open the door to the first step." The key. Ilara turned the wooden sliver. On the back, a small, almost invisible hidden compartment was revealed. Inside, there was no metal key, but a tiny rolled parchment tied with a linen thread. It was so small it barely fit on her fingertip. "What do you bring, Eliana?" Ilara asked, her voice almost a whisper. "The truth, my child, and the promise that you are not alone." Eliana looked at Ilara with an intensity that belied her age. "Theron says the blade is ready, and that the first step must be taken with wisdom, but without hesitation. Kael is preparing. He feels the change in the air. His eyes are everywhere, and he is tightening his grip. The harvest will be his, unless the seed of freedom is planted now." Ilara felt a shiver. Kyle was aware. The urgency was real. She unrolled the parchment with trembling fingers. The writing was minuscule but clear. It was not a message from Theron, but a map. A detailed map of Kyle's castle, with markings at strategic points, secret passages, weak points in the guard, and most importantly, the location of the chamber where Kyle kept the village records, the very ones he used to extort and oppress the people. The key to freedom lies in the truth he hides, Aeliana said, as if reading Ilara's thoughts. The people need to see proof of his tyranny, and the proof is inside. Ilara looked at the map, then at Aeliana. The old healer had risked everything to bring this information. The tension that had suffocated her for weeks now transformed into a cutting clarity. The time for waiting was over. The time for action had arrived. Spring would bring not only the melting snow, but also the awakening of a revolution. And Ilara, the expelled widow, would be its catalyst. The first step would be the most dangerous of all, invading Kyle's castle. The polished wooden sliver, with its red ink dot, seemed to burn in Ilara's palm. The minuscule map, unfolded on the table in the secret chamber, was a labyrinth of lines and symbols, each a promise, each a danger. Aeliana had departed as silently as she arrived, leaving behind not only the information, but the overwhelming weight of responsibility. Kyle knew. He sensed the change in the air, like an animal scenting a storm. The time for waiting had indeed ended. Ilara traced the paths on the map with a trembling finger, secret passages, blind spots in the guard, the records chamber. There lay the truth Kyle hid, the proof of his tyranny, the instrument of his downfall. The key to freedom, as Aeliana had said, lay in truth. But how would she, a lone widow, invade a tyrant's castle? The answer came with the memory of the forge, of gleaming steel, of Theron's strength, and of Aeliana's silent wisdom, who knew every herb, every shadow, every secret of the village. She was not alone. Isolde's network, dormant for generations, was finally weaving itself together. The following night was chosen, a moonless night, with the promise of a persistent drizzle to muffle sounds and obscure shapes. Ilara spent the day in a strange state of calm, a quietude that came from accepting the inevitable. She prepared a simple dinner for her children, told them more stories of heroes and heroines who fought against darkness, and tucked them into bed, kissing their foreheads with a tenderness that carried the promise of a future she was about to fight to secure. When the children slept, Ilara dressed. Not in a widow's clothes, but a hunter's. Dark trousers, a thick wool tunic, soft, silent boots. She tied Isolde's diary to her chest, beneath her tunic, and hid the wooden sliver with the map in a small pocket. At her waist, a dagger she had found among the castle's ancient weapons, more for utility than for combat. Her exit from the secret chamber through the hidden passage was an act of faith. The castle was silent, only the occasional creak of wood and the distant howl of the wind breaking the stillness. She moved like a shadow, every step calculated, every breath held. The drizzle began to fall, a thin veil enveloping the world. The meeting with Theron and Aeliana was at the agreed rendezvous point, a small grotto hidden at the base of the mountain near a rain-swollen stream. Theron was there, imposing even in the darkness, with a heavy blacksmith's hammer in one hand and a short sword in the other. Aeliana, small and hunched, held a pouch of herbs and a small clay vial. "We are ready, Lady Ilara," Theron whispered, his voice grave. The title coming from him resonated with new authority. "The blade is sharp, and the truth will be revealed," Aeliana added, her eyes gleaming in the gloom. The plan was simple, yet audacious. Theron, with his strength, would create a diversion at Kyle's main castle gate, drawing most of the guards. Meanwhile, Ilara and Aeliana would use the secret passages marked on the map to infiltrate. Eliana, with her knowledge of herbs, had a potion to put to sleep the few guards who might be on the internal route. Ilara's objective, the records chamber. Theron's diversion was a thunderous crash that echoed through the mountain. The sound of metal against stone, shouts, and the clamor of guards rushing to the gate. It was their chance. Ilara and Eliana moved quickly, like ghosts, through an ivy-covered crevice in the rock that opened into a damp, dark tunnel. The smell of wet earth and mold filled the air. The tunnel led them into the castle's depths, into a labyrinth of service corridors and pantries. Eliana, with her intuition and Ilara's map, guided them with impressive certainty. They found a guard sleeping soundly at his post, Eliana's potion already taking effect. Ilara felt a shiver, but determination propelled her. The records chamber, a massive oak door secured with a heavy padlock. Ilara knew Kael would trust the key to no one. She examined the lock, remembering Isolde's lessons about ancient mechanisms. With her dagger, she probed, feeling the pins, applying pressure. A soft click, the door opened with a groan. Inside, piles of parchments, ledgers, and wooden boxes. Ilara lit a small candle Eliana had brought. The flickering light revealed the extent of Kael's tyranny. Records of exorbitant taxes, forged debts, stolen lands, names of entire families marked for ruin. And, hidden beneath a pile of contracts, a document with Oakhaven's royal seal. It wasn't hers. It was an ancient decree confirming Kael's possession of certain properties, but with a crucial clause. Provided that Isolde's royal lineage does not present itself with the original deed and blood seal. Ilara felt a chill run down her spine. Kael knew. He knew of the royal deed's existence and of her lineage. He was protecting his power, aware of the threat she represented. But he hadn't expected her to act. She began to gather the most incriminating documents, rolling them up and tying them with cords. The proof of his tyranny would be exposed for the entire village to see. But something was missing, the final piece. It was then she heard it. Footsteps, not the heavy tread of a guard, but light, determined steps. The chamber door swung open, and Kael stood there, his face contorted in a mixture of fury and shock. He held a short sword, its tip pointed directly at Ilara. "The reclusive widow, the rat that crawls in the shadows," Kael hissed, his eyes flashing. "I knew you were more than you seemed, but you made a mistake, woman. This castle is mine. This village is mine." Eliana, who was by the door, threw the contents of the clay vial into Kael's face, a fine, irritating powder. Kael screamed, stumbling back, rubbing his eyes. "You old witch!" he bellowed. But Ilara didn't wait. She pulled Isolde's diary from beneath her tunic, opening it to the page of the royal deed. With her other hand, she took the wooden sliver, the leaf of courage, and broke it open. Inside, there was not just the map, but a small glass vial. She opened it, and a dark red liquid seeped onto the blood seal in the diary. "This castle is not yours, Kael," Ilara said, her voice surprisingly firm, echoing in the chamber. "This village is not yours. It belongs to Isolde's lineage, and I am Isolde, heir of Oakhaven." The blood seal in the diary glowed with a soft red light, pulsing with ancient energy. Kael, despite the irritation in his eyes, saw it. His face paled, shock replacing fury. He knew what that meant. "It's impossible," he whispered, his voice losing its arrogance. "It's not," Ilara retorted, holding the diary and the incriminating documents. "Truth always finds its way, and the truth is, you are a tyrant, Kael, and your time is over." Outside, the sound of voices approached. Theron had succeeded with his diversion, and now, with Eliana's help, he was bringing the people. The smell of wet earth and the promise of a new cycle. Spring would bring not only the melting snow, but also the awakening of a revolution. Ilara, the expelled widow, now stood as the rightful lady of Oakhaven, the catalyst for a new era. The first step had been the most dangerous, but the door to freedom was finally open. The sun would rise soon, illuminating not only the village, but the truth she had unearthed.